My ex mocked, "You can't even keep a secret." So I created a fake social media account, lured him into sending me incriminating messages, then leaked them to his boss. I met Broderick when I was 26, and at first, I thought I'd struck gold. He was a smooth talker, charming in that easy, confident way that drew people to him like moths to a flame. We'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue in Asheville, North Carolina, and from the moment he strolled up with his cocky grin and that dimple he knew was cute, I was intrigued. We talked all night, hours slipping by like minutes, and by the end of the evening, he was all I could think about. It didn't take long before we were spending every weekend together, going on little adventures around the Blue Ridge Mountains, trying every new restaurant in town, and swapping stories about our childhoods. Broderick made me feel seen and important. He seemed genuinely interested in me, in a way I hadn't experienced before, and soon I was sharing things with him I'd never told anyone. I remember how he'd look at me, his eyes warm and focused, and I thought, this is it. This is who I want by my side. We moved in together after 2 years. It felt like the natural next step. People around us started calling us the dream couple, and I loved it. We hosted dinner parties, went on road trips, took pictures at every scenic overlook, and somehow, even the mundane felt magical with Broderick. I'd lie awake some nights, listening to his soft breathing beside me, feeling like I was the luckiest woman alive. Things were good. Perfect, even. Until they weren't. It started as little things. Small changes that, at first, I ignored because, honestly, who doesn't go through rough patches? Broderick started working late, a lot. He'd come home tired, quiet, a far cry from the animated, attentive guy I'd fallen in love with. At first, I chalked it up to stress. His company had been growing rapidly, and he was taking on more responsibility. I even felt a little proud that he was trusted with so much. But the late nights turned into weekends, and the weekends turned into skipped dinners with our friends, canceled plans, and more excuses than I could keep up with. One night, I sat at the dinner table, alone, pushing my food around my plate. He was supposed to be home an hour ago, and when I finally called, he picked up on the third ring, sounding annoyed. "What?" he snapped. "Are you coming home tonight?" I tried to keep my voice steady, calm. "I'm in the middle of something. I told you I'd be late." "Late, yes. But it's already 10. You didn't even call." Silence hung between us, thick and uncomfortable. I could hear voices in the background, laughter even, and my stomach churned. "I'm working, Rhiannon," he said, his voice laced with irritation. "You knew what you signed up for." Those words hit me like a slap, but I bit my tongue. I wasn't going to be the clingy, nagging girlfriend who didn't understand work pressure. "I'm just worried about you. You've been so distant lately." He sighed, the kind of sigh that said he was done with the conversation before it even started. "We'll talk when I get home, okay? Don't wait up." The line went dead, and I stared at my phone, the uneaten food in front of me suddenly turning my stomach. That was the first time I truly felt the shift, the crack that would soon become a chasm. Weeks passed, and Broderick's behavior only worsened. He was moody, always glued to his phone, hiding the screen whenever I walked by. Once, I even saw a text pop up, just a quick flash of a notification from a name I didn't recognize, Celeste. My heart sank, but I pushed it down, telling myself I was being paranoid. One Friday night, after he canceled plans with our friends yet again, I confronted him directly. "Broderick, we need to talk." He looked up from his phone, barely interested, and gave me a tired sigh. "About what?" "This. Us. You're never here. You're always on your phone. You won't talk to me." "Rhiannon, I've got a lot going on right now. You'd understand if you weren't so." He cut himself off, but I knew where he was going with it. The words hung in the air, needy, clingy, insecure. It was the first time he'd looked at me with actual disdain, and it took everything in me not to crumble. I miss you," I whispered, feeling suddenly foolish. He rolled his eyes, letting out a mocking chuckle. "You always have to make everything about you, don't you?" Those words stung. I'd spent years supporting him, making sacrifices for his career, his needs, and now he was acting like I was some kind of burden. That night, after he fell asleep, I couldn't get his words out of my head. I needed to know what was going on, but I hated the idea of snooping. It felt like a betrayal in itself. But my gut told me there was something more, something he wasn't telling me, and finally, I caved. I unlocked his old laptop, the one he rarely used but still kept around, and started digging. And there it was. Message after message between him and Celeste. I could barely breathe as I scrolled through, each line cutting deeper than the last. They'd been meeting for months, and not only that, he'd been complaining about me to her, mocking me in ways I never would have imagined. She'd ask questions about us, and he'd laugh, saying things like, "Oh, Rhiannon's clueless. She wouldn't know a secret if it hit her in the face." I felt sick, my hands shaking as I closed the laptop. I sat there, numb, trying to make sense of it all. The man I'd loved, the man I'd trusted with my heart and soul, had reduced me to nothing more than a punchline in his secret life. The next day, I confronted him. I waited until he came home, made sure he couldn't dodge me with another late night at work excuse. When he walked in, I was waiting at the kitchen table, the laptop sitting in front of me like a loaded gun. "Rhiannon, what's this?" he asked, already defensive. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You tell me, Broderick. Who's Celeste?" He froze, his face dropping for just a split second before he regained his composure, shrugging like it was no big deal. "She's a friend." "Really?" "Because friends don't usually talk about their girlfriends like that. Friends don't sneak around behind their backs." I could feel my anger bubbling over, hot and uncontainable. Broderick's face twisted, a sneer breaking through. "You know, maybe if you weren't so uptight, so desperate to control everything, I wouldn't have to find someone who actually lets me breathe." I blinked, stunned. "Are you blaming me for this?" He laughed, cold and mean, crossing his arms. "Maybe if you stopped acting like some martyr and actually gave me some space, this wouldn't have happened." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. His words felt like a knife to the chest. This man I'd loved, the man I'd built my life around, was standing there, belittling me, making me feel like I was somehow at fault for his betrayal. I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of the room, feeling the weight of every step. I locked myself in the bathroom, collapsing on the floor, shaking with rage and disbelief. How could he do this to me? How could he turn this around like it was my fault? The next few days were a blur. I avoided him, barely able to look at him without feeling sick. My friends started to notice something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them, feeling too humiliated to admit that my so-called perfect relationship was a sham. But one night, as I lay in bed, replaying his words over and over in my mind, "You couldn't keep a secret if it hit you in the face," I felt something shift inside me. His mocking tone, his smug expression. I couldn't get them out of my head. If he thought I was weak, incapable of keeping a secret, then maybe it was time to show him just how wrong he was. With a new sense of resolve, I got out of bed and started my plan. It was petty, it was risky, and it might even backfire, but at that moment, I didn't care. I needed him to understand the pain he'd caused, and I knew exactly how to do it. For the next few days, I kept to myself, acting like I was defeated, barely saying a word to Broderick, who carried on like he'd won some twisted game. But underneath, I was simmering, planning my revenge. I knew it had to be something he'd never see coming, something that would hit him where it hurt most, his reputation and his job. I created a new social media account, carefully crafting a fake identity that would be just his type. She was flirty, confident, a little mysterious, a girl who'd know exactly how to appeal to his ego. I picked the name Allegra, imagining her as the kind of woman Broderick would trip over himself to impress. At first, I only followed a few people from his work circle and liked his company's posts. I let him notice Allegra before sending him a message. Broderick was an easy read, and within a few days, he messaged first, jumping right into flirty banter like the sleazy charmer he was. "Hey, Allegra. New around here?" Smirking face. I replied, pretending to be charmed by his attention, slowly reeling him in. I let him believe Allegra was someone outside his usual world, someone he could talk to without any strings attached. I'd keep the conversations light, letting him do most of the talking. And just as I suspected, Broderick soon couldn't resist bragging about himself, painting himself as some kind of tragic hero trapped in a relationship with a controlling, clueless girlfriend. "Oh, trust me," he typed one night, "I know how to keep secrets. I've been keeping them from my girlfriend for years." He added a winking emoji, as if that made it funny. It hurt, reading those words, but I bit back my emotions, focusing on the goal. I needed more. So I nudged him with questions that fed his ego, asking things like, "But if you're such a secretive guy, wouldn't your boss be surprised? Or you seem like you're under a lot of pressure at work, maybe you need someone to take your mind off it." Sure enough, Broderick couldn't resist. Over the next week, he started slipping up, letting Allegra in on little things about his boss, his team, even some office politics that could easily get him in trouble. He'd laugh, saying stuff like, "Nobody would ever believe it if they knew how much dirt I've got on my own company." He was sending screenshots, making shady comments about his colleagues, and once he even hinted that he had used company money to pay for a few business dinners with people who were definitely not business partners. I saved every single message. Every screenshot, every compromising line, every comment that hinted at his unethical behavior. It was almost too easy. Broderick trusted Allegra without a second thought, too wrapped up in his own ego to see the trap he was walking into. Then, when I had enough ammunition, I waited. I knew his company had a quarterly review coming up. He'd mentioned it to Allegra in a message, complaining about his boss and how uptight the higher-ups were getting about his spending. I knew this was the perfect time to strike. The night before the review, I sent an anonymous email to his boss, attaching the messages and screenshots. I laid it out clearly, evidence of Broderick's reckless behavior, his disregard for company policies, and the disrespectful way he'd spoken about his boss and colleagues. I didn't say who I was or give any details that could trace back to me. I simply signed it, "A concerned party." Then, I sat back and waited. The next day, Broderick left the house like any other day, completely unaware of the storm heading his way. Around noon, I got a text from a mutual friend, Sandra, who worked in the same building. "Hey, Rhiannon. Did you hear about Broderick?" My heart pounded, but I played it cool. "No, what happened?" "They called him into HR. There's this big scandal, they found out he's been misusing company funds. Apparently, someone sent in proof." "Oh, wow." I typed back, adding a shocked face emoji. Later that evening, Broderick came home, his face pale, eyes wide with shock and anger. He looked like he'd been hit by a truck. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice innocent. They fired me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Someone sent my boss a bunch of messages. They think I've been stealing, Rhiannon. They think I've been screwing them over. I don't know who did this. But it's not true. You believe me, don't you?" I looked at him, forcing myself to keep a neutral expression. I felt an odd sense of peace as I stared into his panicked eyes. "Broderick, I don't know what to believe anymore," I said quietly, letting those words sink in. "You've lied to me, to your company. Maybe this is karma catching up with you." His face twisted with desperation. "Karma? Are you serious? This is my life, Rhiannon. I've been framed." "Maybe," I shrugged, "but it's hard to feel sorry for someone who keeps secrets." Broderick looked like he wanted to argue, to lash out, but he knew he'd already lost. The man who once thought he was untouchable was now scrambling for any lifeline, and I wasn't about to throw him one. Over the next few weeks, Broderick's life crumbled piece by piece. Word spread fast in our small town. Friends started distancing themselves, people whispered whenever he walked by, and he could barely show his face without someone making a comment about the guy who stole from his own company. Even Celeste, who I later learned worked at a nearby bar, ghosted him the second she heard about his downfall. One evening, he showed up at my door, looking haggard and desperate. "Rhiannon, please," he begged, barely holding it together. "I don't know where else to go. I lost my job, my friends won't even talk to me, and I don't have anywhere else to turn." I stared at him, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. I could have let him in, I could have forgiven him, I could have given him a shred of comfort. But instead, I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I think you need to find someone else to help you," I said, my voice calm and firm. "You made your choices, Broderick. Now you get to live with them." He looked at me, utterly defeated. For once, he had no clever retorts, no mocking laughs, no smug smiles. Just a broken man, standing on my doorstep, watching the last person who ever cared about him turn her back. As I closed the door, I felt lighter than I had in months. I walked back into my home, finally free, feeling the weight of his lies lift from my shoulders. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined for us, but it was the ending that gave me peace. And sometimes, that's all the closure you need.